Hello and welcome back to another tutorial. I'll try and keep this short and sweet, but add as much information as I possibly can. I know that some viewers have suggested to try and keep the average time down on tutorials. I do like to try and expand and try and give as much as possible. I know that there are lots of tutorials that offer very similar content. I'll just try to add more than what maybe you would find in other tutorials. This tutorial focuses on creating constraints in our table. So take, for example, the age field here. We might want to make a constraint to prevent users from typing in a specific age range. So for example, if we know that our system should only hold the age between 10 and 20, we would make a constraint to prevent anyone else from typing in any other numbers. This type of constraint is very easy to set up. In actual fact, I'm just pointing you over here to the documentation because some might just want to quickly read through, and you have all the information that you need. So we have here, for example, the check constraint that we're going to implement, and here's an example. So why might you want to stay on and follow this tutorial? Well, we're going to go ahead and apply a test first approach. So we'll set up Pytest, and then we go ahead and create a test to check a constraint in the database. Obviously that won't exist to begin with, so the test will fail. And then we go ahead and create a check constraint in the database, in our model, and then hopefully at that point everything will be resolved. So I will try and add in some additional information, and I guess this tutorial is very much focused on the beginner, or at the beginner level. So next up, we'll then explore this a little bit further, because if you're already familiar with the Django admin site, you know that if you register one of your models, you can then go ahead into the admin site and then add some data to your database. So we're going to go ahead, first of all, create a test to test a custom form validation of a form that we used in the Django admin website. And we'll go ahead then and create a custom form, and I'll quickly show how to build a custom form. So maybe you want to edit what users can input in the admin site for a particular model. So we'll go ahead and build a custom form, and of course then the test will then return true. And again, I'll try and add some additional information which might support this process and point you towards some of resources and information that you might want to follow on after this tutorial. So go ahead if you like and download the repository. There's a link in the video description, and go ahead and create a new virtual environment if you like, and you'll find that there's a requirements text file. So let's just quickly go ahead and pip install those requirements. So we're going to need the R flag for that. There we go. And once that's all installed, we can start. So first up, let's go ahead and create a new file. We're going to call this Pytest. It does that every time. Pytest.ini. Okay, and I'm going to need some settings here. So I just go ahead and type in Pytest, and then we're going to need to define the Django settings module. Okay, so Django settings with an S, module equals core.settings. Okay, so that's just going to point Pytest to the Django settings file, and then we're going to say, or tell Pytest what files we want to associate with tests. So that equals, for example, test.py. So all files that begin with tests are going to be looked at by Pytest, and then our tests are going to be in these files. All right, so with that in place, let's just run Pytest. See if it works okay, and that's what we should have so far. There are no tests, therefore it hasn't picked up any tests or run any tests, but that's where you should be right now. So now we can go about making a test. So just to remind ourselves what we want to do, we want to be able to filter or create some sort of way of preventing users of typing in the age between 1 to 9 and 1 to 9 and 21 onwards. So we only want to save in this field numbers between 10, the age of 10, and 20. So we're going to go ahead and build the test first, and then go ahead and develop. So kind of a test first approach. So let's get rid of that. Let's go into our student here, and we're going to build a new file. We're going to call that test.py. and it looks like it already exists. So it already exists. So let's go ahead now and develop a test. So first of all, we're going to probably need some of the tools from Pytest. So let's go ahead and bring those in first. So that's just going to be import Pytest. And what we're going to need to do essentially is create a test and maybe test the outer boundaries of our number system. So we only want to be able to enter the ages 10 to 20. So 9 should cause a fail and 21 should cause a fail. So from the Pytest tools, we're going to use the Parametrized Functions. So parameterize. So that's going to allow us to, first of all, define the field that we want to run these numbers, following numbers. And let's go ahead and do that. And now we want to define what numbers we want to define. So for example, 9 should fail, and then also 21 should fail. So we're going to use these numbers in a series of tests. So essentially we're going to run a test and loop around that test twice because there's 2 numbers to test. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and put a comma there. Let's go ahead and create a function, the actual test. So it's going to be called test student age. And then we're going to need the database, so DB, the test database, and then the age. So essentially just going to grab these numbers one by one and loop this test with both these numbers. So we are going to need to create data in the database to actually test to see if this works. So objects.create, and then we're going to need all the fields. So first name, surname, age, classroom, and teacher. So we're going to enter that into the database. So let's just make sure we've got word wrap on. And let's go ahead and say first name equals, and then F name, for example. And let's say then surname equals whatever it needs to equal, S name. And then we got the age. So age is going to equal age. This is a reference here to the ages that we're going to pass in. So we're passing in the age, and then we're going to test that. So essentially we're going to run this test twice, utilizing the age 9 and then the age 21, which we're passing in here. So that's how it's working. And of course we can add more data, we can pass in more data. So this is classroom equals 100, for example. And then the last of all, I think, is teacher. So that can be whatever it is, teacher name, I think. So let's go ahead and run this. So this is Pytest. We use the V for some added information. And you can see here that, you can register custom marks. So pytest.mark.parameterize. Have I spelled that right? I know I haven't. It's an E, isn't it? Okay, so let's do that again, Pytest. So this time you can say that name student is not defined because we're calling a model which we haven't actually defined yet. So it's looking for this model and it doesn't know anything about this model, this page, this document. So we need to bring that in. So we're going to say from student.models, let's import student. So now we have access to that model. So this time you can now see that the yellow line has disappeared. So let's go ahead now and run Pytest again. And you can see this time it says creating test database. So every time we run these tests, it's going to create a test database. It's not going to use the real database. And you can see here that we have an integrity error, CheckConstraint failed, age. So these tutorials are meant to be about learning, and I've tried to trip you up here. I wonder what you can see what the problem might be. So here what the problem is that you've probably downloaded this and you probably find that there are migrations already existing. So what we need to do is just refresh the database, if you like, and start the database all over again. What's happened here is there may be some existing kind of code that's hung around with some examples that I've had, or this example that I was developing. So I'm just going to get rid of that. I'm going to get rid of the database here. Okay, so we now have a fresh database. So let's go ahead and just create or make migrations. And then we go ahead and migrate this. Okay, so we've got a fresh database now. So let's now run Pytest again. And you can now see that our tests are passed. So essentially what we have now is we've tested to make sure that we can actually build this data in our database. And you can see that we actually can. Now, obviously that's not the test we want to create, because in actual fact, entering this data in the database, our database should cause an error because we don't want to be able to add those numbers into the database. And of course, we've not made those changes yet because we're running this type of test first approach. So we want to make a test that actually fails to begin with so that we can then create or adapt our model to fit our test. So let's go ahead and do that. So first of all, we're going to need to, or what's going to be produced here is an integrity error. So let's go ahead and make sure that that can happen. So Django.db, we're going to import the integrity error. So that's going to allow us to essentially be able to raise an integrity error. So what's going to happen is that we're going to say with Pytest.raises integrity error. Okay, so basically we're going to run this code and we're going to capture, we're going to colon here. We're going to capture the fact that this should produce an integrity error. Okay, so let's run the test again, Pytest. And you can now see it says did not raise. So let me just bring this up a little bit. So basically it did not raise the integrity error because in actual fact, we saw earlier that this code is running okay because at the moment we don't actually have any constraints set on our database. So our tests are failing and exactly where we need to be right now. So this kind of test first approach. So now we've made a successful test, this test should return true. So by creating two new fields, utilizing these values as ages on our database, it should cause an integrity error and we should then capture it here. So these tests should actually pass. So obviously now what we need to do is go into our models and now develop our code so that this test will pass. So let's now open up our model here and we have our database. So we now want to create or utilize the CheckConstraint facility that we have in Django. So let's go back here. You can see again the documentation. It gives us a little bit of information about constraints. One of them is the CheckConstraint. It allows us to make a check constraint in the database. So let's go ahead and define our class meta. So it's worth noting at this point, you may look, or you may find, or you may be studying Python at the same time as Django. So you may find something called meta class in Python. So this is not meta class in terms of a meta class in Python. This is meta inner, if you like, which is essentially just a class container with some metadata. This is where the word meta comes from, attached to the model. So it helps us to define some additional parameters. So you may have used class method before, for example, to order by a certain field, or maybe add some kind of a verbose name, for example, for the table. So you may have already utilized class meta before, but I just didn't want you to get mixed up with class meta here, this kind of inner class container which adds some metadata to our class, and actual something called meta class in Python, which is something completely different. So now we're just going to go ahead and add some metadata, if you like. So we're going to now just define the constraints that we want to apply in this table. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to say models. So we're going to stem from models dot, and then we're going to use, which we know is from the documentation, is CheckConstraint. And now we want to define our constraint. So in the documentation, we're told this is a Q object or Boolean expression. So we're going to create a Q object. If you're not familiar with Q objects, then go ahead and just read a little bit about Q objects. But this allows us to, as it says here, represent SQL condition that can be used in a database related operations, similar to F, but essentially it allows us to combine operators such as or and to create a more kind of complex lookup here, a complex query. So Q is going to allow us to chain OR, so we can create a filter, if you like, and chain them together utilizing Q. So let's go ahead now and do exactly that. So we're told in the documentation that we need to define check equals, and then let's go ahead and set up this. So remember, we want only to be able to enter the age between 10 and 20. So let's do this. So Q, and then let's say age, and then greater than or equal to equals 10. So the age must be from greater than or equal to 10. And now we can use Q again to kind of chain this together, if you like. So and then let's define another Q. So this is going to be age is less than or equal to equals 20. So we're told in the documentation that we need to supply a name for this. So let's go ahead and do that. So comma name equals, let's just call this age constraint. And let's just call this age 10 to 20, for example. Yeah, age 10 to 20. Okay, so supply a name, and there we go. So that's a simple way of creating a constraint here on the age field. Right, so this is considered to be at the database level, this type of constraint. So we can also build constraints at the model level, if you like, and we'll have a look at that shortly and what that might mean. But hopefully now what we've done is we've created our constraint, and potentially now can go back into Pytest and run our test and see that it did not raise. So at this point, can you think of why it didn't raise? Well, what we need to do, if we do add any meta constraints here, we are going to need to make migrations again. You can see that it's now going to apply this. So we're going to create a constraint. It's got the name on the model student, and then we are going to need to then migrate again before we can then actually test this out. So Pytest again, and you can see this time we've now passed. So it is indeed now, our tests are now producing an integrity error when we try to enter the age 9 and 21. And we can test that, of course. So if we change this to 10, well, 10 shouldn't raise an integrity error because that's what's allowed in the database field. So we try this again, and you can see that it does cause an error. Failed, did not raise. And that's then obviously referring to this number here, 10. That failed to raise the integrity error. And so obviously that is allowed in the database. So let's just change that back, run that again, and there we go. So as I previously mentioned, I suggested that we created a constraint at the database level. So let's just look at the default behavior here. So for example, let's go ahead, and I'm just going to go ahead. Oh, actually, I've already done this. So we're going to create a new super user. So Python manage.py create super user. So I've created this user already, so it's already taken. So admin and your password. So just go ahead and do that. So I'll just create a new user. Yep. So create a new user. Okay, and then you can see that in the admin, on the admin page here, we've gone ahead and registered the student and teacher model. So that should be available in the admin. On the admin page. So let's go ahead now and run the Python manage.py run server. So just go back into the server. So navigate your way over to the home page and then just access the admin area. So mine's just admin. So inside of here we have students and teachers. So we registered those two models. So we can go into students, add new students, and this time you can see I can add username and surname. Let's add a number that's out of range. There we go. So I press save. What's going to happen now? We have an integrity error. So by creating a check constraint, it's going to produce a integrity error. And that can be quite difficult to kind of control and to work with. So that can be quite difficult to deal with, potentially. You want a much easier way of creating a way of informing the user that they've entered the wrong information. So we can also add a constraint on the model level, if you like, and that's going to produce a validation error. So we can create a validation error on the form. So let's go back here. So what we're going to do is now we're going to recreate this model for no particular reason, just to show you how to do that. So we're going to create our own, form here. Sorry, not model. We're going to create our own form here, custom form, and then we're going to add or connect a validation error. We're going to raise a validation error. So we're going to build a constraint on the age like we've done previously. But this time we're going to call or raise a validation error. And that's just going to produce a piece of text above here just to tell the users they've entered the wrong numbers. And that's potentially a cleaner way or much easier way for us to use Django out of the box to create some sort of useful functionality. Whereas previously you saw the check constraint, that's going to produce an error which is going to make it harder for us to actually then manage within our application. Let's go back into our models. I'll just put that back. Let's go back into our models and let's go ahead now and create our constraint, say at the model level. So let's delve back into the documentation. It's well worth reading through creating forms from models. So if you have a look at this, let's go to clean. It starts to tell us about validation on model form. And then down here, it talks about overriding the clean method. So we can override clean method on the model form to provide additional validation in the same way you can do on a normal form. So essentially clean here is a way of us creating some sort of additional validation in our model, for example. So let's go ahead and utilize this in our application. So first of all, we're going to be creating a validation error. So I've already imported in validation error, so we can raise a validation error. Let's go ahead now and have a look at def clean. Okay, just pass for now. So if you want to know how, or the steps behind the scenes involved in validating data being entered into a model, for example, it's well worth reading through the model.clean, model.validate unique, and the process or the steps that are performed, as well as the full clean method, to get a better insight on what's happening behind the scenes. Because here really you can start to think about customizing in a deeper level what happens, for example, when you start to save data, what you can do to create custom functionality in that space. Now, a bit further down here, it tells us a little bit more about model.clean. This method should be used to provide custom model validation and to modify attributes on your model if desired. So here it's suggesting that we can use it to provide automatic values for a field, or for example, validation that requires access to more than a single field. So we're going to utilize this to create a validation check on the age field to make sure that the user enters in the form a number between 10 and 20. So let's go ahead and now bring in self so we can access the data in the form, for example. So if self.age, so if the instance, the data we're trying to save, age is, for example, over 20, then we're going to raise an error, for example. So let's just set this up first. So raise, and then we're going to raise a validation error. And then, for example, we can define, for example, what the output is. So age, let's say, for example, let's say age needs to be under 20, for example. So you can see I use the underscore there. I just have the translation tools imported at the top there. So yeah, so here what we've done is create a simple if statement to check to see if the age is over 20. If it is, then we're going to run the validation error. So let's go ahead and test this out. So we're back in our administration area. Let's go ahead and see if we can now add some new data. So we're going to add 21 and then classroom and teacher. Let's go ahead and have a look. So this time you can see it says age needs to be under 20. So let's, for the sake of simplicity, let's just extend this, or self.age is less than 10. So if the number's between 10 and 20, we're going to be okay. Otherwise, we're going to produce a validation error. So let's try, for example, 9 now and save. You can see we get the error, and then 10, we're okay. So when you are utilizing these tools for constraints, it's well worth reading the documentation. So for example, here we are told that the clean method is not invoked when you call the model save method. So there may be more than one ways to actually save data. And for example, this could potentially cause a problem whereby your data isn't going to be validated. So potentially that is something to think about. Up here, of course, you've still got your constraint, and that's still potentially going to capture the error, or is going to capture to prevent the user from entering that data into a database if the numbers don't meet what's been set out here in the constraint. So I already realized that we've gone ahead and built the function here without actually testing first, and I felt as though that was probably the better way of doing it in hindsight, because it helps us understand what's going on before we build the test in this case, whereas the constraint was a little bit more simplistic for us to understand to build the test first. In addition to that, I also said that I was going to build a custom form for the admin area. So we'll build the exactly same form that's there in the admin area, but we'll just build a custom form. So let's go ahead and do that first. So let's create a new file. Let's call this forms.py. So do that. And then let's go ahead and in the forms, we're going to say from.models. Let's go ahead and import student. Okay. And then from Django, let's go ahead and import forms. Right, so let's go ahead and create a class. So we're going to call this student form, and then we're going to take in forms.model form. And then let's go ahead and have class meta, and then model equals student. And let's just define our fields. So we're just going to have all of them. You can obviously define what fields you want to utilize in this form, but we're just going to say all, and there we go. So that's our simple form that we developed there. So let's just close that. Let's go back into the admin area, and now we want to kind of tile that together. So instead of using the form that's been utilized here to build a new student, we've just simply defined our own form. Now it should look exactly the same because we just said to utilize all fields, but you might want to change that in the forms. Right, so let's go ahead now, and we're now going to say from dot, so this current folder directory, we have forms, so dot import forms. And then from there, we can then go ahead and create a new class, so we can add, so let's say student admin, and then we're going to say admin dot model admin. Yep. And from there, we're going to say form. We're going to define the form or override the form with our new form, which is going to be the form.student form. That was forms.student form. Just double check that. Student form. Okay. So that's our form. So we don't need, well, let's just extend this. So model.student. And then we want to also pass in the information in student admin. So that will then kind of bring in the form, our custom form. So that's a simple way of creating a custom form for our admin page. So now we have this custom form, we can go ahead and test it. We could have done it the other way around, but I chose not to. So that's the admin setup. So let's now build a test for this. So right, so first of all, let's just bring in everything we need. So we're going to need a form. So from students.form forms, let's go ahead and import students, or student, that's what's coming up, student forms. Let's go ahead and import student form. And now let's go ahead and build a test. So I just wrap that so we can see that. So this is going to be, let's just call this test student form. Okay. So this time, let's just first of all set up the data that we're going to need in our test. So data, this is the data we're going to insert into the form, of course. So first name, whatever that is, and comma, of course, and then surname, whatever that is. And then we're going to need, in addition to that, we're going to need age. So this time we're just going to manually put age in. So we're going to define, for example, 21. So that should cause an error, of course. And then we go ahead and add classroom. And then finally, teacher. So these are all the fields in the form and the data that we're going to pass into our form, if you like. Okay. Right, so now let's go ahead and say form, form equals student form, and then we define the data that we're going to pass in. Data equals data. So this is the data we're going to kind of pass in to our form, and then we're going to test our form to see if it's actually inserting correctly. So force equals form.isValid. So we're going to use isValid to check to see if the form is valid against the database. So if the data is correct, it's going to be valid true, and therefore if the data is inserted, it will be true. So it won't assert to false, it will assert to true. So therefore the test will fail. But obviously we've entered 21 here. So form is valid will be false because we cannot or shouldn't be able to enter 21 into our form because the highest number should be 20 that we can add into the age field in our database. So hopefully now, if I just stop that and start the server again, looks to be an error here. Attributes form student needs updating. So just going back into the form here. So fields. Okay, I think that's the issue there. Give that a go. Yep, so I forgot the S on the end, so that was in the form. So let's go ahead and just close this server here. Let's run Pytest again. And you can see that everything at the moment is passing. Okay. So let's remember what's happening here. We're saying that we cannot validate this against a database. We're saying false. So this form data is invalid, therefore producing false. So if I added true here, we're saying that this data can be added to the database, which it can't, of course. So if we then run the test again, it should fail because we can't add 31. We can add 10, so that should cause a successful test. But of course, we added a number outside the boundaries. So therefore, this test should return false. So in actual fact, everything is working absolutely fine. So hopefully that's given you some insights into using constraints at a database level, if you like, and then at the model level here, validating a form. And of course, we created a custom form just to add some additional information and then went ahead and then run a test on that form. So I apologize if that was a little bit long-winded. Hopefully there was some value there, and I'll go ahead and create some more tutorials in this area. Now I decided to make some shorter tutorials, although this tutorial was probably a little bit longer than expected on different aspects. If there's any changes you want me to make, for example, or maybe cut down a little bit more, or you feel as though that I should be expanding in certain areas, everyone's going to have their own opinion, of course, and I'm always happy to take opinions and ideas on how to improve the tutorials. So I do hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.